There is something about a knock at the door in the dead of night that reaches into the most primitive part of the human brain. Not the kind of knock that comes at noon on a Tuesday when a neighbor borrows sugar. Not the kind that comes at 6 in the evening when a friend drops by unannounced. The knock that comes when the world is still and dark and sleeping, that knock is different. It carries weight before the door is ever opened. It carries a question that has no easy answer: who would come this late, and why? Most people, when they hear that knock, feel the hair rise on the back of their arms. They pause. They listen. They look through the peephole, or they call out, "Who is it?" And then they make a decision, the kind of decision that, in most cases, leads to nothing more than a neighbor who locked themselves out, or a delivery driver with the wrong address, or a lost stranger asking for directions. In most cases, the door opens, the moment passes, and life goes on. But sometimes that knock doesn't lead somewhere safe. Sometimes that knock is the last sound a person hears before everything falls apart. There is a particular cruelty in the way violence can find someone in the one place they were supposed to be most protected. In the one space they had built around their children, around their routines, around the small and ordinary rhythms of daily life. The home is supposed to be the place where the world cannot reach you. It is supposed to be the wall between what is safe and what is dangerous. And yet, in cases like Amy's, the very act of responding to that door, an act of ordinary, trusting humanity, became the thing that ended her life. This is Amy's story. And before we go any further, before we open that door and step into the darkness that followed, take a second and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from right now. It genuinely means everything to know who is out there listening. If this kind of storytelling matters to you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Amy's case has gone quiet for too long. The more people who know her name, the better the chance that justice finally finds its way to her door. Now, let's begin. Girard, Georgia is the kind of town that most people drive through without stopping. It sits in Burke County, tucked into the rural flatlands of eastern Georgia, where the roads run long and straight through pine trees and open fields, and where everybody tends to know everybody else's name, or at least their face. The population hovers in the hundreds. There is a quietness to it that is almost physical, a kind of stillness that settles over the streets in the early morning hours when the night is thick and the houses are dark. It is the kind of place where serious crime is supposed to be rare. Where a murder is not just a news story, it is a rupture in the fabric of everything people believe about where they live and who they live among. On the morning of March 7, 2012, that rupture came. At approximately 5:54 in the morning, a dispatcher at the Burke County Sheriff's office received a 911 call. The voice on the other end of the line was young. Very young. It was the voice of a child. The dispatcher spoke calmly, the way trained dispatchers do, keeping her voice steady even as the information coming through the phone sent a chill through the room. "You just woke up?" the dispatcher asked. "Yeah," the child said. "Tell me what your mom is doing." There was a pause, the kind of pause that stretches out like a canyon, filled with things that cannot be unsaid. "She's laying on the floor," the child said. "Bloody. Everywhere." The dispatcher kept her voice level. "You keep that phone with you. I'm going to have an ambulance coming." "Okay," the child said. And then, barely above a whisper, "Just get here fast. Because we're here alone." Those words, "we're here alone," stayed with everyone who heard them. Because behind that voice, somewhere in that small home on Brigham Landing Road, there were two other little girls. 3 children, in total, ages 5, 8, and 11. 3 little girls who had gone to sleep the night before in the safety of their mother's home, and who had woken up to something no child should ever have to find. Their mother, Amy Jane Ellison Nichols, was 27 years old. She was lying on the floor of her living room, shot once in the stomach. She was not just a mother of 3. She was pregnant. The baby she was carrying, the 4th child she had been preparing for, the sibling her daughters had been anticipating, was gone too. When law enforcement arrived at 220 Brigham Landing Road that morning, they found the 3 girls huddled together in a corner of the hallway. They were not standing near their mother. They were pressed against the wall, close to each other, the way children instinctively press together when the world becomes something they cannot understand. Moments later, Amy's sister, Angel Heath, arrived. She had received a call from the oldest girl, the same child who had dialed 911, and she had driven over as fast as she could. "I got over there as fast as I could," Angel would later recall, her voice breaking at the edges the way grief breaks voices that have been trying to hold themselves together. The girls was huddled up in the corner in the hallway. They weren't even standing by their mom. When I come in and I seen her laying there, I'm screaming her name. Then I realized she was gone. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Nothing had been ransacked. No drawers were pulled open. No furniture was overturned. Whatever had happened here, it was not a robbery. Nothing appeared to have been taken. There was no sign of forced entry. The door had been opened from the inside. And that single, devastating detail, that quiet door, undamaged and unlocked, would become the center of an investigation that, more than a decade later, still has no resolution. Sheriff Greg Coursey, who led the Burke County Sheriff's Office at the time, stood outside that house on Brigham Landing Road in the pale light of that March morning and tried to find words for what his department had just encountered. "Any murder is an awful thing," he said. "But to take the life of a young woman with 3 children and leave her to die in that house, what could be worse?" It was a question without an answer. Or rather, it was a question whose answer was still walking free somewhere, someone who had knocked on Amy Ellison's door in the middle of the night, waited for her to open it, and fired a single bullet into the stomach of a pregnant 27-year-old woman. Within hours of the discovery, 6 to 9 investigators from both the Burke County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation were deployed to the case. They fanned out through the neighborhood, knocked on doors, collected statements. They combed through Amy's phone records. They pulled her Facebook messages. They talked to her co-workers, her neighbors, her friends. In the first week alone, more than 20 people were interviewed, several of them multiple times. And every single one of those people, according to Sheriff Coursey, described Amy Ellison Nichols the same way, as a hard-working woman and a loving mother. Not a woman who had enemies. Not a woman who had known violence. Not a woman who anyone believed could be at the center of something like this. So then the question that filled every room in that investigation, every conversation between detectives, every sleepless hour of that first week, was the same question that Angel Heath was asking from the corner of that hallway. Why Amy? Because GBI Agent Ayers said it plainly, even in those first chaotic days, this does not appear to be a random act of violence. Someone had come to Amy's door that night with a purpose. And the most chilling part, the detail that would haunt this case for years, was that investigators believed, based on everything they had found, that Amy had probably known the person on the other side of that door. She had opened it, after all. She had opened it. To understand what was lost on that March morning in Girard, you have to understand who Amy Jane Ellison was before she became a case number in a Georgia Bureau of Investigation file. She was born on June 6, 1984, in Augusta, Georgia, a city of some size and character, with its hospitals and its history and its Augusta National Golf Club drawing visitors from around the world. But Augusta was not the world Amy grew up in. She grew up in the close-knit rural communities of Burke County, the kind of upbringing that puts deep roots in a person. Her parents were Daryl and Marilyn Ellison. She had siblings, a sister named Angel, and brothers named Nathan and John. They were a family in the truest sense, people who knew each other not just as relatives but as constants, as anchors, as the people you called first when things went wrong. Angel was not just Amy's sister. She was, by every account, Amy's best friend. The closeness between them was the kind that transcends ordinary sisterhood, the kind where you finish each other's sentences, where you show up without being asked, where the sound of someone's laugh becomes part of the soundtrack of your own life. All 3 of them, when they laugh they sound just like her, Angel would say years after Amy's death, talking about her nieces. They've just got this giggle about them. And I tell them, you sound just like your mom. That laugh, whatever it sounded like, whatever lightness it carried into whatever room Amy happened to be standing in, seems to have been one of the first things people noticed about her. She lit up the room with her smile, her obituary would say, and those are words that get written about a lot of people who pass on, sometimes as a kind courtesy to the grieving. But in Amy's case, the people who knew her say them with a specificity that suggests they mean it. She was genuinely warm. She was genuinely present. She was the kind of person who made the people around her feel like they mattered. By 2012, Amy had built a life that centered almost entirely on her 3 daughters. Rachel was 11. Natalie was 8. Catelyn was 5. They were, in Amy's own words, her 3 favorite people. She wrote that on her Facebook page, and she meant it the way a person means the truest thing they have ever said about themselves. Everything Amy did, every shift she worked, every errand she ran, every evening she spent at home, circled back to those 3 girls. She talked about taking them to school. She wrote about all of them piling up together at night in her queen-sized bed, a tangle of arms and legs and soft breathing, the way families do when the world outside has gone quiet and the only thing that exists is the warmth of people who love each other. On February 21, 2012, less than 2 weeks before she was killed, Amy posted a photograph from her sonogram. She wrote about the baby's strong heartbeat. She described the baby's small arms and legs with the particular tenderness of a mother who has already begun to build a relationship with a child she has not yet met. And then she wrote something that captures, in a single sentence, everything about who Amy Ellison was. "I think I'm more excited than my sister." There it is. Even in the private joy of expecting a 4th child, Amy's first instinct was to reach outward, to think about Angel, to imagine her sister's excitement, to situate her own happiness inside the happiness of the people she loved. That is who she was. That is the woman who answered a knock on her door in the middle of the night in early March of 2012 and never got to come back. She had a husband, Alan Nichols, whose name appears in her obituary alongside her daughters and her siblings and her parents. She had a coworker who, in the days after Amy's death, stood in front of a news camera with grief in her eyes and said one word to describe Amy Ellison Nichols: wonderful. Just that. Wonderful. Not complicated. Not qualified. Just wonderful, the way you describe someone whose goodness was so self-evident it needed no further elaboration. Amy worked. She kept a house. She raised her children. She posted on Facebook about the ordinary textures of daily life, taking the girls to school, the sonogram, the small moments that accumulate into a life. In the weeks before her death, nothing in her public behavior suggested she was afraid. Nothing suggested she was in hiding, or watching over her shoulder, or aware that something dangerous was gathering in the dark around her. But investigators, in the days after her death, would begin to look more carefully at the private architecture of Amy's life, the parts of it that didn't appear on Facebook. The phone records. The correspondences. The conversations that happened in real rooms between real people rather than on the surface of a social media page. Because the absence of forced entry, and the absence of robbery, and the apparent willingness of Amy to open her door to whoever knocked, those 3 facts together told investigators something that no public post could tell them. Someone in Amy's life had reason to want her gone. FBI agent Ayers was careful in those first days. He chose his words the way investigators do when they're trying to say something important without saying more than they should. "This does not appear to be a random act of violence," he told reporters. "I can't preclude the possibility, but right now I don't believe it is." And then he said the thing that would reverberate through everything that followed: "I believe Nichols knew the person who took her life." 20+ people had already been interviewed. Phone records were being examined. Facebook messages were being read. The investigation was moving, and moving fast, and yet, somewhere out there, in Girard or beyond it, someone who knew exactly what had happened was waking up that morning in their own home, with blood not on their hands but on their conscience, and going about their day. That is the part of these cases that never becomes normal, no matter how many times it is encountered. The investigation unfolds at one speed and the world goes on at another. While detectives are pulling cell records and knocking on doors, the person responsible for Amy's death was eating breakfast. Driving somewhere. Maybe talking to people who had no idea who they were talking to. Living inside the terrible luxury of a secret that only they possessed. And somewhere in Girard, 3 little girls, Rachel, Natalie, and Catelyn, were being taken care of by Angel and others, trying to make sense of a world that no longer had their mother in it. The days immediately after the discovery were a strange, suspended kind of time. The crime scene tape came and eventually went. The investigators' cars that had filled the quiet road outside the house on Brigham Landing Road slowly thinned. The news cameras moved on to other stories. But for the people who loved Amy, there was no moving on. There was only the weight of what had happened, and the question that grew heavier with each passing day. Who knocked on her door that night? Because somewhere in the 20+ interviews that investigators had already conducted, somewhere in the phone records and the Facebook messages and the surveillance footage being combed through by people working 6 to 9 at a time around the clock, was the answer. It had to be. The people closest to Amy knew things. They had to. Someone in that web of relationships and daily life had a piece of the truth. The question was whether they would tell it. And the answer to that question, the thing that would define not just this investigation but the entire arc of Amy's case, would not come as easily as anyone hoped. The night of March 6, 2012, was a Tuesday. There is nothing historically significant about that Tuesday. No major event marked it in the wider world. It was simply a late winter evening in rural Georgia, the air still carrying the remnant chill of February, the days beginning to stretch just slightly longer as the calendar turned toward spring. For the people of Girard, it was a night like other nights, quiet roads, dark houses, the particular peace of a small town settling into sleep. Inside the home at 220 Brigham Landing Road, Amy's evening would have been shaped by the rhythms she knew best. 3 girls to feed, to bathe, to settle into bed. The ordinary exhaustion of a working mother, the kind that weighs comfortably on the body after a day well spent, the kind that leads to sleep easily and completely. Amy was 27, pregnant, and the sole active presence in a household of children who depended on her for everything. Her evenings were not her own, and she would not have had it any other way. The last posts on her Facebook page were ordinary. Work. The girls. The baby. The small satisfactions and small frustrations of a life built close to the people you love. There was nothing in those digital traces that said, "Today is different. Today is the last one." At some point during that night, in the hours after the girls were asleep and the house had gone quiet, something changed. Investigators believed it was in the middle of the night, somewhere in the dark stretch of hours between the end of Tuesday and the beginning of Wednesday. The precise time is not publicly established in court documents, because this case has never gone to court. But the window, based on when emergency services were called and when the oldest daughter found her mother, points to somewhere in the early morning, deep into that darkness that feels different from ordinary darkness, heavier and more complete. Someone came to the house on Brigham Landing Road. They came without making themselves known in the way a welcome visitor would. They came without calling ahead, without texting, without the social signals that precede legitimate late-night arrivals. They came and they knocked. That knock, its sound traveling through the walls of the house, reaching Amy wherever she was, became the pivot point of everything. Here is what is known: Amy got up. She moved toward the door. She opened it, or moved close enough to it that she was exposed to whoever was on the other side. And then a single bullet struck her in the stomach. A single bullet. Not a burst of gunfire. Not the chaos of a struggle. One deliberate shot, placed in the center of her body, in the location that would kill not only Amy but the unborn child she was carrying. And then the shooter was gone. Into the dark. Into the night. Into whatever life they returned to after walking away from Brigham Landing Road. The children were upstairs, or in their rooms, presumably still asleep when the shot was fired. At some point in those hours, we don't know if it was immediately or after time had passed, the oldest girl woke up. She came out. She walked toward the hallway, or the living room, or some convergence of the two where Amy lay. And she found what no 11-year-old should ever find. Her mother, on the floor. Blood. She did what she had probably been told to do in an emergency. She called 911. And her voice, when it comes across that recording, is one of the most devastating things to hear, because it is not hysterical the way adult voices become hysterical in crisis. It is measured in that strange way that children sometimes become measured when reality outstrips their capacity to process it. It is a voice in shock, asking for help with a terrible calm that is itself a form of heartbreak. She's laying on the floor. Bloody. Everywhere. And then, just get here fast. Because we're here alone. When Angel Heath arrived after that second phone call, she found the 3 girls pressed into the corner of the hallway, together, as if proximity to each other was the only thing left to hold on to. Rachel. Natalie. Catelyn. 5, 8, and 11 years old. Their mother on the floor. Their unborn sibling gone with her. When I come in and I seen her laying there, Angel said, "I'm screaming her name." Then I realized she was gone. The scene that investigators processed in those early morning hours told a story through its silences. There was no forced entry, the door had not been broken, the lock had not been picked. The door had opened willingly, from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle that had begun somewhere else in the house and worked its way to Amy's body. She had gone to the door. She had opened it. And she had been shot. Nothing had been taken. No electronics. No valuables. No cash, if there was cash to be taken. The home had not been searched. The bedrooms had not been touched. The children had not been harmed. This was not a robbery. This was not a stranger who had arrived at a random house and knocked on a random door and committed a random act of terrible violence. This was targeted. Burke County Sheriff Greg Coursey said it in plain language at a press conference shortly after the discovery. We believe that Nichols knew the person who took her life. That word, knew, is where the case both clarifies and complicates itself. Because if Amy knew the person, then the investigation cannot be cast outward into an anonymous pool of suspects. It has to go inward. It has to go into the people and relationships and histories that surrounded Amy Ellison in her daily life. It has to ask harder questions about harder subjects. And investigators were asking them. More than 20 people had already been interviewed in the first week. Several of them were brought back multiple times. The phone records were being examined line by line. The Facebook correspondences, every message sent and received in the period leading up to Amy's death, were being read by investigators looking for something that didn't fit, some tension or conflict or threat that hadn't been visible on the surface. At the same time, the feticide charge was being discussed. Under Georgia law, which had been updated in 2006, a feticide charge could be applied regardless of how far along a pregnancy was. District Attorney Ashley Wright confirmed this, noting that the old standard, which required the fetus to be quick, meaning capable of movement, had been replaced with a law that protected all pregnancies from their earliest stages. Sheriff Coursey was clear, in addition to murder, his agency intended to pursue a feticide charge. The person who killed Amy Ellison had killed 2 people. 2 people. That detail does something to the weight of the case. It transforms it from a single act of violence into something even more deliberate, even more calculated. Because the shot was placed in Amy's stomach. Not her chest. Not her head. Her stomach, where the baby was. Whether that placement was intentional, whether the shooter knew exactly what they were aiming at, is something that investigators have never publicly confirmed or denied. But the question hangs over the case like everything else that has never been answered, heavy, persistent, impossible to let go of. Meanwhile, in the quiet of that investigation's first week, the coworker who went on camera to talk about Amy said one word. Just one. Wonderful. She had worked alongside this woman. She had watched her show up, day after day, with her smile and her energy and her particular way of making the people around her feel like they were worth something. And now she stood in front of a camera and tried to compress that person into language, and all she could find was, wonderful. Rachel. Natalie. Catelyn. A smile that lit up the room. A laugh that would live on in the giggle of 3 daughters. A sonogram photo posted on February 21st with the words, I think I'm more excited than my sister. And somewhere in the investigation, in the phone records, in the Facebook messages, in the 20+ interviews, was the answer to who had taken all of that away. The question was, how close was it? In the days and weeks following Amy's murder, the investigation moved in the way serious homicide investigations do, broadly at first, and then with increasing focus. The initial stage of any murder inquiry casts a wide net. You talk to everyone. You verify alibis. You look for inconsistencies. You build a map of the victim's life and then you start examining every relationship on that map, every person whose presence intersects with the details of what happened. What investigators had to work with was a set of facts that pointed strongly in one direction without confirming it. No forced entry. No robbery. A single bullet placed in Amy's stomach. A knock answered in the middle of the night. A killer who knew exactly when to come, exactly how to knock in a way that Amy would open the door, and exactly how to disappear before anyone else in the house was aware of what had happened. The expertise of the crime. That is what investigators call it, not necessarily technical expertise, but situational expertise. The killer had knowledge. They knew where Amy lived. They knew her schedule, or at minimum knew she was home and that she would be alone with her children at that hour. They knew that knocking would bring her to the door rather than to a phone or a window. They knew that opening that door would be the act of a woman who trusted whoever was on the other side, at least enough to approach. All of this knowledge points in the same direction that it always points in cases like this, inward. Toward the circle of people who were close to Amy. GBI investigators were working alongside Burke County deputies, and both agencies were clear that they were not releasing information about suspects or persons of interest to the public. This is standard practice in active homicide investigations. You don't tip your hand, you don't name names until you have something that will hold up in a courtroom. But the restraint in what they were saying publicly was not matched by the urgency of what they were doing privately. 6 to 9 investigators, every day, working the case. Phone records. Facebook messages. Financial records. Surveillance footage from any available cameras in the area. The methodical, painstaking work of trying to build a case from evidence. One detail that kept surfacing in the investigation, that law enforcement referenced not just in the immediate aftermath but in a 5-year follow-up as well, was Amy's pregnancy. Sheriff Alfonso Williams, who took over the Burke County Sheriff's office and revisited the case in 2017, said it plainly. I think Amy was specifically targeted for a specific reason, and we just need to find out what that is. And then, about the pregnancy, we know that somebody knows what happened, and I believe there's more than one person that knows what happened. More than one person. That phrasing is significant. It suggests that this was not something one individual carried alone into the silence of the following years. It suggests that the secret of what happened to Amy Ellison on Brigham Landing Road was shared. That somewhere, maybe in Girard, maybe in Burke County, maybe further afield, there were people who had knowledge of the crime, either before it happened or after, and who had made a choice to stay quiet. Why would someone stay quiet about the murder of a 27-year-old pregnant woman and her unborn child? Fear is the most obvious answer. If the person who committed this crime was capable of knocking on a door in the middle of the night and shooting a pregnant woman in the stomach, they were capable of other things too. People who know dangerous things about dangerous people often calculate, consciously or not, whether the cost of speaking up is one they can afford to pay. And in small, tight communities, where everyone knows everyone, that calculation becomes even more fraught. Telling what you know might mean implicating someone whose family you also know. Whose children are in school with your children. Whose name is on a business down the road from yours. Silence, in those circumstances, is not always cowardice. Sometimes it is something more complicated, a tangle of fear and loyalty and self-preservation that is difficult to judge from the outside. But silence has consequences. And in Amy's case, the consequence of that silence was a case that went cold. There is a particular cruelty to cold cases that is different from the cruelty of active investigations. In an active investigation, there is movement. There is the sense that answers are being pursued, that the machinery of justice is in motion. In a cold case, that motion has slowed or stopped. The file exists. The case number exists. But the daily work, the detectives, the interviews, the urgent combing through of evidence, has receded. What remains is the family, still carrying the weight of an unanswered question, and the community, still holding the knowledge that someone who did this terrible thing has never been held accountable. Angel Heath, speaking to reporters in 2017, 5 years after her sister's death, put it in the simplest and most devastating terms possible. I fear that we'll never know, she said. We'll never have justice. Never find out exactly who did it. 5 years had passed. Her nieces were growing up. Rachel was now 16. Natalie was 13. Catelyn was 10. They were girls who carried the sound of their mother's laugh in their own giggles, who had been shaped by her absence as much as by the years she had been present. They were going to school, and doing the things that children do, and living inside a grief that most adults never have to carry, the grief of a parent lost to violence, with no closure, no verdict, Northwest Day in court where someone finally said, "This is what happened and this is who did it." And Angel was watching all of this. Amy's 3 daughters will never giggle with their mom about boys or high school, she said. They'll never meet the sibling she was pregnant with. And her sister will never hug her best friend again. There is a moment in cases like this, cases that go unsolved for years, for decades, when the question of justice begins to feel almost secondary to the question of truth. Because justice, as a legal mechanism, requires a prosecution, a trial, a verdict. Truth, in some cases, is simpler, it is just the knowing. It is just the family being able to say we know what happened. Even if the person responsible has died, Even if no prosecution is ever possible, the knowing would be something. It would be the ability to stop asking. Amy's family was still asking. More than a decade in, they were still asking. And the case that was supposed to answer those questions, the investigation that had employed 6 to 9 people around the clock in that first urgent week, that had combed through phone records and Facebook messages and interviewed more than 20 people, had never produced a public arrest. Had never produced a named suspect. Had offered, 5 years in, a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. $10,000 in exchange for the truth about who killed Amy Ellison and her unborn child. As of 2022, 10 years after the murder, the reward was still waiting to be claimed. And somewhere, in Burke County or beyond it, someone was still keeping the secret that Amy's family needed to hear. When a murder goes unsolved, the silence around it does not stay neutral. It fills. It fills with theories and speculation and the particular restlessness of people who know that something terrible happened and have not been told who is responsible. In a small community like Girard, that silence becomes almost audible, a tension in the spaces between conversations, a thing that is felt but not spoken about directly. In the years following Amy's death, that silence was broken occasionally by the periodic re-emergence of the case in regional news, an anniversary piece, a reward announcement, an interview with Angel about her ongoing grief. Each of these moments briefly illuminated the case again, bringing new eyes to the known facts and pulling the thread of public attention back toward Brigham Landing Road. But none of them produced the break that investigators were looking for. None of them produced the person with the piece of knowledge that would unlock everything else. What investigators had publicly confirmed, years into the investigation, was the following: the murder was not random. Amy was the specific target. Her pregnancy may have played a role in the motive. Someone knocked on her door and she opened it. Nothing was taken from the home. There were no signs of forced entry. That is a significant collection of confirmed facts. Each one, taken alone, is a detail. Taken together, they form a kind of portrait, not of a killer, because no killer has ever been named, but of a crime that had intent, and history, and personal motivation behind it. The pregnancy detail is the one that investigators kept returning to. In 2017, Sheriff Williams said it explicitly: the pregnancy may have been a motive. Not a tangential detail. Not a coincidence. A motive. The reason for the crime. What would make a pregnancy a motive for murder? This is where responsible journalism and responsible storytelling have to be careful, because motives, in an unsolved case, are necessarily speculative. No one has been charged. No one has been tried. No evidence has been presented in a court of law. What exists is a set of facts from which patterns can be inferred, but which cannot be treated as proof of any specific theory. With that in mind, investigators and analysts who have looked at cases like this one, cases where a woman is killed and her pregnancy is cited as a possible motive, have identified several categories of circumstance that can produce this kind of violence. Relationship conflict is one. A person who did not want Amy to have a child, whether because of the implications for their own life, their own freedom, their own family, might have acted to prevent it through the most extreme means possible. Paternity disputes are another avenue investigators typically examine, the question of who fathered the child, and what the revelation or acknowledgement of that fact might mean for one or more individuals. These are not accusations. These are the kinds of questions that any competent homicide investigation would ask, and that investigators in this case almost certainly did ask, in those interviews and phone record reviews and Facebook message examinations in the weeks and months after Amy's death. What is striking, in retrospect, is how much the investigation gathered in that first urgent week, and how little of it was ever made public. More than 20 people interviewed. Phone records. Facebook messages. Financial records. A GBI agent who said, with confidence, that this was not random. That Amy likely knew her killer. And then, silence. Not the silence of a case abandoned, but the silence of a case that is, technically, still open, still assigned a case number, still part of the GBI's unsolved homicide database, still associated with a $10,000 reward that has never been collected. The silence of a case that accumulated evidence but never accumulated enough to charge someone. Or, and this is the other possibility that families in these situations live with, the silence of a case where investigators know more than they've said publicly, and are waiting for something, a witness willing to come forward, a piece of physical evidence that hasn't yet been analyzed, a development in a related matter that would finally break the dam. There is a detail from the 2017 coverage that Sheriff Williams offered that has not received enough attention. He said, "We know that somebody knows what happened, and I believe there's more than one person that knows what happened." More than one person. That is not an offhand remark. That is a specific characterization of what investigators believed about the structure of knowledge around this crime. It means that the person who pulled the trigger was not the only person in possession of the truth. Someone else knew. Maybe they knew before. Maybe they learned after. Maybe they were told by the person responsible. Maybe they witnessed something, or heard something, or were close enough to the situation to put the pieces together. And they chose not to speak. Year after year, through the anniversaries and the reward announcements and the news segments and the appeals from Angel Heath, they chose not to speak. Why? The people who study these dynamics, the silences that surround violent crimes in close communities, will tell you that the reasons are complex and often deeply human. Loyalty to people you have known your whole life. Fear of what disclosure might cost you, your safety, your relationships, your standing in the community. The psychological defense mechanisms that allow people to minimize, rationalize, or compartmentalize knowledge they cannot bear to act on. Sometimes people genuinely convince themselves that what they know is not certain enough to be actionable. That they could be wrong. That the consequences of being wrong, of putting someone through the machinery of a murder investigation on the basis of incomplete information, outweigh the costs of saying nothing. None of these things make silence the right choice when a woman and her unborn child are dead and the person responsible is living freely. But they make silence an explicable choice. And understanding why people stay silent is the first step toward creating the conditions under which they might finally speak. That is what the reward was meant to do, create a condition. Put a dollar figure on the information, make the act of speaking into something with a tangible outcome. $10,000. Not a life-changing sum, in the abstract, but potentially significant to someone in a small Georgia county who had been sitting on a secret for years and who might finally, under the right circumstances, decide that the weight of it was more than they could carry. The $10,000 was unclaimed as of the last public reporting on the case. The silence held. But here is what also holds, on the other side of that silence, the case is still open. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation still maintains it in their unsolved homicide database. The Burke County Sheriff's Office still lists contact information for anyone with information. The case has not been closed, has not been declared unsolvable, has not been set aside as permanently beyond reach. It is waiting. And Amy's daughters, who were 5, 8, and 11 years old when their mother was killed, who are now young women in their 20s, are waiting too. Rachel. Natalie. Catelyn. They grew up without their mother's hand to hold at school events, without her voice on the phone when they had their first heartbreak, without her presence at the graduations and the milestones that came one after another through the years. They grew up with Angel's voice telling them, "You sound just like your mom." They grew up carrying a grief that never fully resolved, because grief that has no answer at the center of it cannot resolve, it can only be carried, year after year, like a weight you learn to live with because you have no choice. And somewhere in Georgia, someone who knows the truth about what happened on Brigham Landing Road on the night of March 6, 2012, someone who chose, year after year, not to speak, has been carrying something too. A different kind of weight. The question is which one will break first. There is a way that cases like Amy's reveal something larger than the crime itself. They reveal something about the structures of knowledge in close communities, about who knows what, and who tells whom, and why certain truths circulate in private while remaining hidden from the people who most need them. Every unsolved murder in a small town exists inside a web of relationships where people often know more than they tell investigators. Not always out of malice. Sometimes out of fear. Sometimes out of misplaced loyalty. Sometimes because the knowledge they carry is fragmentary, a piece here, a feeling there, something they witnessed but couldn't interpret at the time, and they have never found a way to put it together into something that felt worth saying out loud. But in Amy's case, Sheriff Williams made it explicit. More than one person knows. That means somewhere in the network of people who surrounded Amy's life, in Girard, in Burke County, in whatever corners of Georgia her relationships extended into, there were individuals in 2012, and potentially in 2017, and potentially still now, who held a piece of this puzzle. In the absence of public arrests or named suspects, the case has lived primarily in the minds of Amy's family and in the public forums, the crime forums, the true crime communities online, where people who never knew Amy have tried to examine the available facts and make sense of them. Websleuths, one of the most prominent online crime discussion forums, has had threads dedicated to Amy's case since the days immediately following her murder. The earliest posts, from March 2012, capture the raw immediacy of those first hours and days, people in Girard and Burke County sharing what they'd heard from local contacts, noting that the case doesn't appear to be random, speculating about the domestic angle given that the children were unharmed. The online community has long operated on the same logic that investigators stated publicly. If the children were unharmed, if whoever knocked on that door that night had no intention of hurting anyone except Amy, then the crime was personal. Targeted. The children were not the object of the violence. Amy was. And the bullet placed in her stomach, rather than in her chest or her head, has been a point of repeated discussion. Some have interpreted its placement as intentional, as a specific decision to end not just Amy's life but the life of the child she was carrying. Others are more cautious, noting that placement cannot be interpreted as intent without forensic context that has not been publicly released. What the online discussion reflects, more than anything, is the hunger for answers that unsolved cases create, a hunger that is experienced not only by Amy's family but by strangers who have encountered her story and been changed by it in some small way. People who will never visit Girard, Georgia, who have no connection to Burke County, who knew nothing about Amy Ellison until they came across a news article or a podcast or a forum post, and who found, in the details of her case, something that refused to let them go. That is what this kind of case does. It refuses. It refuses because the facts are simultaneously clear enough to suggest an answer and incomplete enough to withhold it. It refuses because the victim is someone so precisely drawn, 3 daughters, a 4th on the way, a Facebook post about a sonogram, a coworker saying wonderful with the finality of someone who means it, that she cannot be abstracted into statistics. It refuses because the specific image of an 11-year-old child making a 911 call, her voice steady with the terrible calm of shock, her final words to the dispatcher, "Just get here fast, because we're here alone," is something that once heard cannot be unheard. In 2022, on the 10th anniversary of Amy's death, the case resurfaced again in regional coverage. WRBL, a Georgia news station, ran a piece marking the anniversary. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Unsolved homicide page still listed Amy's name, her age, her location. The contact information for the Burke County Sheriff's Office and the GBI was still there. A decade. Amy's daughters were now adults. Rachel was 21. Natalie was 18. Caitlin was 15. They had grown up in the years that their mother should have occupied. They had moved through middle school and high school and into whatever came next, carrying the absence of a woman who had called them her 3 favorite people and who had planned, with the specific joy of a mother who knew exactly what she was doing, to bring a 4th child into that circle of love. The child she was carrying when she died would have been 10 years old at the anniversary. That is the detail that does not get easier with time. That is the one that sits in the chest and does not move. A child who never had the chance to laugh like Amy. In 2017, when Sheriff Williams announced the $10,000 reward and spoke to media about the case, he was careful but direct in a way that suggested the investigation was not as cold as the public might assume. The specificity of his comments, the pregnancy as a possible motive, the certainty that more than one person had knowledge, the conviction that Amy had been specifically targeted for a specific reason, spoke to an investigative team that had formed clear beliefs about what had happened, even in the absence of enough evidence to take those beliefs into a courtroom. "I think Amy was specifically targeted for a specific reason," Williams said, "and we just need to find out what that is." That phrasing, "we just need to find out what that is interesting, because it simultaneously acknowledges what investigators believe and acknowledges the gap between belief and proof. They had a theory. Perhaps more than a theory. But theories do not make arrests. Theories do not sustain convictions. What makes arrests is evidence, physical evidence, witness testimony, a confession, a cell tower ping, a DNA match, a financial record that puts someone somewhere they claimed not to be. And whatever evidence had been collected in those first urgent weeks of the investigation had not been sufficient to cross the threshold from theory to charge. Was it close? Had investigators gotten within reach of an answer and then watched it slip away, a witness who changed their story, a piece of evidence that was inadmissible, a suspect who lawyered up at exactly the right moment? Or had the case stalled earlier than that, in the murk of conflicting information and closed mouths and a community that knew more than it was saying? The honest answer is, we don't know. And the fact that we don't know is itself a testament to how effectively certain people have kept their silence. But here is something that is worth sitting with, particularly for anyone who is watching this and who lives in Burke County, or who grew up near Girard, or who knew Amy Ellison in any capacity. Amy's case is still open. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation is still accepting information. The Burke County Sheriff's Office is still accepting calls. The reward, $10,000, is still available to anyone with information that leads to an arrest and conviction. The contact number for the Burke County Sheriff's Office is 706-554-2133. The GBI's Region 7 office in Thompson, Georgia can be reached at 706-595-2575. Those numbers have been public since 2012. They will remain public until the day this case is resolved. And if you are someone who is carrying a piece of this, if you know something, even something small, even something that seems incomplete or uncertain, the investigators working this case have been clear from the beginning. They believe more than one person knows what happened. That means there is more than one chance for someone to finally make the call. Amy's daughters are waiting. Angel is waiting. Justice, for Amy Ellison and her unborn child, is waiting. There is a pattern that emerges when you look at cases like Amy's, cases that stay open for years, cases that resist resolution despite the best efforts of investigators, cases where the known facts form a coherent shape but the final piece never materializes. The pattern has to do with proximity. With how close the answer is to the question. Because in the overwhelming majority of homicides that eventually get solved, the person responsible turns out to be someone the victim already knew, someone whose name was in that pool of 20-plus interviews, someone whose phone number appeared in the records that were already being examined in that first frantic week. The answer, in other words, is almost always already in the room. Burke County investigators had that room. They had the interviews. They had the phone records. They had the Facebook correspondences. They had the physical evidence from the crime scene at 220 Brigham Landing Road. They had the GBI's resources and expertise working alongside their own. And they had, from a very early stage, a clear conviction: this was not random. Amy knew her killer. The pregnancy was possibly the motive. What they did not have, or did not have in sufficient form to take to court, was the proof. Understanding the gap between knowledge and proof is essential to understanding why cases like this remain open for so long. Investigators can be virtually certain about what happened and still be unable to prosecute it, because the American legal system, the adversarial system of prosecution and defense, of evidence standards and reasonable doubt, demands more than certainty. It demands demonstrable facts. It demands a chain of evidence that can be presented to a jury and that survives cross-examination. It demands witness testimony that doesn't crumble when challenged. It demands physical evidence that was handled correctly and that ties a specific person to a specific act. In cases that happen in private spaces, in homes, in the dark, with no witnesses except the children who were asleep when it occurred, that chain is genuinely difficult to build. There are no cameras. There is often little physical trace from a single gunshot homicide beyond the bullet itself and the trajectory evidence. The killer's identity is not stamped on the scene. What you have is a body, a bullet, and the circumstantial architecture of a life, relationships, conversations, history, motive, and you have to build your case from that. Which is why the witness testimony matters so enormously. Which is why the "more than one person knows" comment from Sheriff Williams is so significant. Because if someone out there has first-hand knowledge of who knocked on Amy's door, or if someone was told, in the days or weeks or months after the murder, by the person who did it, then their testimony is the piece that could make a case prosecutable. That is what the $10,000 reward was reaching for. Not just information in the abstract, but the specific, actionable information that would allow investigators to build the chain of evidence they needed. And it has not yet been claimed. It is worth pausing here to consider what more than a decade of silence means for the person, or persons, carrying knowledge of this crime. There is research in criminology and psychology about what happens to people who know about violent crimes and choose not to report them. The weight of that knowledge does not diminish over time. It tends to do the opposite, to compound, to accumulate, to become more rather than less present in the psyche of the person carrying it. The original decision not to speak gets reinforced each time the anniversary passes, each time the case surfaces in the news, each time someone mentions Amy's name. Each of those moments is an opportunity to come forward, and each time that opportunity passes unclaimed, the decision to remain silent is effectively made again. Active or passive, it is still a choice. And each time that choice is made, 3 women who grew up without their mother move further into a life that Amy was supposed to share. Rachel. Natalie. Caitlin. They have lived, since they were 5 and 8 and 11 years old, inside the particular reality of violent loss. Not just loss, violent loss. Loss that came with a 911 call and blood on the floor and a question that no one has answered. Loss that came with years of watching their aunt's grief, their grandparents' grief, and their own grief intertwined, all of them orbiting the same absence, the same unanswered question. Angel Heath said, in 2017, something that has stayed with everyone who heard it, I fear that we'll never know. We'll never have justice. Never find out exactly who did it. That fear, of permanent not knowing, is a specific kind of grief that sits alongside the ordinary grief of losing a person. Ordinary grief, if such a thing can be said to exist, has a shape. It has the milestones that therapists and grief counselors describe, the acute phase, the integration, the slow and uneven process of building a life that accommodates the absence. But grief complicated by an unsolved murder has a different shape, or rather, it has a hole in it. A place where the question lives. And as long as the question is open, the grief cannot fully close around it. This is the harm that unsolved cases do to families. Not just the initial harm, which is devastating enough, but the prolonged, ongoing harm of uncertainty. The thing that should have happened in a courtroom, the naming, the accounting, the verdict, never happened. And so the family is left to carry not just their loss but the unresolved question of who is responsible for it. And meanwhile, the 3 daughters of Amy Ellison have grown into young women who have never known who stole their mother from them. Who have never sat in a courtroom and heard the answer they were owed. Who have had to build their adult lives on a foundation that has this specific, unaddressed wound at its center. That is the real cost of the silence. Not abstract. Not theoretical. 3 women, in Georgia, who deserve an answer that the people around this case have declined to give them. The last time Amy was publicly photographed alive, or at least, the last image of her that circulates in the public record, she looks like herself. Like the woman people describe, warm, present, with a quality of aliveness that is its own kind of argument against everything that followed. She was 27 years old. She was 3 months shy of her 28th birthday. She had 3 daughters and a baby on the way and a Facebook post from the 21st of February that said, I think I'm more excited than my sister. That post, that small, joyful, outward-turned expression of anticipation, was one of the last things Amy wrote about her life before it was taken from her. She was not afraid. She was not hiding. She was a woman in the middle of ordinary life, surrounded by the people she loved, looking forward. And 14 days after she posted that sonogram photo, someone knocked on her door. And she opened it. And the world that Amy had been building, the world she had been building for Rachel and Natalie and Caitlin and the baby she hadn't yet named, went dark. There are some stories that do not end. Not because they have no ending, but because the ending has not yet arrived, because the machinery of resolution has stalled somewhere between the crime and the courtroom, and what remains is the wound itself, still open, still asking. Amy Ellison's story is one of those. More than 13 years have passed since the morning of March 7, 2012. 13 years since the 911 dispatcher in Burke County answered a call from an 11-year-old girl. 13 years since Angel Heath arrived at the house on Brigham Landing Road and found her 3 nieces pressed into the corner of the hallway and her sister gone. 13 years since Amy Jane Ellison Nichols, 27 years old, mother of 3, carrying her 4th child, became the subject of a murder investigation that to this day has not produced a single public arrest. In those 13 years, the world has changed in ways that Amy never got to see. Her daughters have grown up. Rachel, Natalie, and Caitlin, the 5, the 8, and the 11-year-old who woke up on that March morning to find their mother on the floor, are now in their 20s. They have become people Amy would not recognize and would absolutely recognize at the same time, because children become their parents in the ways that matter most, in the gestures, in the laugh, in the instinctive warmth. Angel hears it in their giggle. She hears Amy every time she is with them. And she tells them so. You sound just like your mom. That sentence is simultaneously a gift and a wound. It is Angel refusing to let Amy disappear entirely from the lives of the people who loved her, insisting on the echo, on the continuity, on the way the dead remain present in the living. And it is also a reminder, every time it is spoken, of the absence itself. You sound like someone who is gone. You carry a person who cannot carry herself anymore. The baby Amy was expecting in 2012, the one whose heartbeat she posted about on February 21st, the one whose small arms and legs she described with the particular tenderness of a mother already in love. That baby would have been 13 years old now. Would have been growing up alongside Rachel and Natalie and Catelyn, in whatever life unfolded after the murder. Would have been someone who laughed like Amy. Would have been someone Angel would recognize by their giggle. There is no name on record for that baby. They never got one. They never got a first breath, or a first word, or a first day of school. They existed, fully and completely, in the sonogram photo Amy posted to Facebook and in the paragraph Amy wrote about a strong heartbeat and small arms and legs. And then they were gone, on the same morning their mother was gone, in a crime that Georgia law recognized as the murder of 2 people. 2 people. That is the correct number, and the law acknowledged it. The feticide charge that Sheriff Corsi said the investigation would pursue, the charge that Georgia's updated 2006 law made possible regardless of the pregnancy stage, was part of the official framework of this case. The person who fired that shot was responsible for 2 deaths. 2 separate victims. A 27-year-old woman and her unborn child. And for both of those victims, there has been no justice. No arrest. No trial. No verdict. Northwest Day in court where the facts were laid out in front of a jury and someone was held to account. Burke County Sheriff Alfonso Williams was direct, in 2017, about what he believed: someone plotted to shoot a pregnant mother in the stomach. That is a characterization of intent. Of premeditation. Of a person who came to Brigham Landing Road with a purpose that went beyond Amy alone, who came, in Williams's reading of the evidence, to end both of those lives specifically and deliberately. That is the kind of violence that does not emerge from nowhere. That is the kind of violence that has a history behind it, a building of resentment or fear or desperation that accumulated over time and eventually found its expression in a knock on a door in the middle of the night. There were people in Amy's life who would have known about that history. Who would have seen its edges? Who would have been present for conversations or situations that, in retrospect, would have looked different, would have sounded different, once the news of Amy's murder reached them. And some of those people are still out there. Still carrying whatever they know. Sheriff Williams said it as clearly as it could be said: we know that somebody knows what happened, and I believe there's more than one person that knows what happened. If that is true in 2017, it is almost certainly still true today. Knowledge of this kind does not evaporate. It lives in memory, and memory is remarkably durable. People who were in their 20s or 30s in 2012 are now in their 30s or 40s. They have lived years inside whatever they know. They have experienced, over and over, the particular discomfort of carrying a secret that the world needs to hear. They have read the anniversary coverage. They have maybe heard Amy's daughters' names. They have maybe encountered Angel's grief from some distance and felt, however briefly, the weight of their own silence reflected back at them. There is a statistic that is worth knowing. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, in its broader analysis of violent crime in the state, has noted that by 2022, 68% of violent crimes reported to police in Georgia were not solved. That is a large number. And it reflects, in part, precisely the dynamic that is at work in Amy's case: the gap between what investigators know and what they can prove, the role of witness silence, the difficulty of building an evidence-based case in private spaces with no independent witnesses. But cold cases get solved. Not always. Not even usually. But they do get solved, and they get solved for a variety of reasons: advances in forensic technology, witnesses who eventually break their silence, deathbed confessions, related arrests that provide new leverage, DNA testing of evidence collected in the original investigation. The fact that a case is cold does not mean it is permanently beyond reach. It means it is waiting. Amy's case is waiting. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Unsolved homicide page is a record of waiting, of cases that have not been abandoned, that still carry the contact information, the reward amounts, the last known details. Amy's name is on that page. Her case number is live. The people responsible for investigating it have never publicly closed the book. And if you are watching this right now, if you grew up in Burke County, if you knew Amy or knew the people around her, if you have ever heard a story or a rumor or a detail that felt off, that felt connected, that stayed with you even as you tried to move past it, the number to call is still active. The Burke County Sheriff's Office can be reached at 706-554-2133. The GBI's Region 7 office in Thompson can be reached at 706-595-2575. The $10,000 reward is still available. Anonymity is possible. The door to this investigation has never been closed. Reach out. Please. Rachel. Natalie. Caitlin. They deserve to know. Because this is what Amy Ellison was. She was a woman born in Augusta, Georgia, on June 6, 1984. She was the daughter of Daryl and Marilyn. She was the sister, the best friend, of Angel. She was the mother of 3 girls who called her everything and whom she called her 3 favorite people. She was a woman who on February 21, 2012, posted a sonogram photo and wrote about a strong heartbeat and small arms and legs with the specific, unguarded joy of someone who knows exactly what they have been given and is not afraid to say so. She was a woman who a coworker described, with the economy of someone who could not find a bigger word, as wonderful. She was not a case file. She was not a reward amount. She was not a data point in an unsolved homicide database. She was Amy. And she walked to her door in the middle of the night on March 6, 2012, because someone knocked, and she trusted that the world would treat that trust the way it should be treated. And she was wrong. And the person who made her wrong, the person who betrayed the most basic covenant of community and proximity and trust, has never been held to account. When a case goes unsolved, it is sometimes described as having gone cold. But cold is not the right word for what Amy's case is. Cold suggests indifference. Suggests temperature. Suggests something that has simply become less than it was. Amy's case is not cold. It is unfinished. It is an open wound in a family that has been waiting, for more than 13 years, for the closure that justice is supposed to provide. And somewhere, in Burke County, in Georgia, in the conscience of someone who has chosen silence over truth, year after year, anniversary after anniversary, the answer is still alive. Someone knows. Someone knows exactly who knocked on Amy Ellison's door that night. And until that person speaks, until the silence finally breaks, a mother who called her daughters her 3 favorite people, who posted a sonogram photo and talked about a strong heartbeat and small arms and legs, who lit up the room with her smile and left a laugh that still echoes in the giggles of her daughters more than a decade later, will remain without justice. Amy's door opened that night. And the truth about what stood on the other side of it is still out there. Waiting to be named. If you have made it to the end of this story, thank you. It means more than you know that you stayed. That you listened. That you gave Amy Ellison the attention her story deserves. If this moved you, if it stayed with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear Amy's name, and subscribe so you never miss another story. Leave a comment below, tell us your thoughts on this case, tell us what you think happened, tell us where you're watching from. Every comment keeps Amy's story in front of new eyes. Every share is a chance that someone with information sees this and finally makes the call. Amy's daughters are still waiting. Let's not let them wait forever.